Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 403, featuring Karin Fong, who is a director over at Imaginary Forces. Absolutely wonderful person. Had the chance to meet her at THU earlier in this September, and we filmed this in THU, so actually you should go check out the YouTube because we were able to do it in person in the setting of THU at the Oasis, which is a lot of fun. So yeah, it was great to be able to do that. But I want to talk a little bit about Karin and Imaginary Forces. She is a wonderful person. She's a director and mostly done a lot of title design. As you may know, Imaginary Forces is famous for a lot of its very, very important title design work, including titles like Mad Men, Stranger Things, Boardwalk Empire, Cowboy Bebop, Spider-Man No Way Home, just name a few. And Karin is responsible for many of those. And she has done some really great work. And actually, this is a subject that I think a lot of people should know more about. And title design is absolutely important part of our, of our world and of what we do in movie making. And something that sometimes it's all overlooked and incredibly important, like Saul Bass's work that he's did back in the 60s. So really cool to talk to Karin about that subject. So I was very happy to hear about that and sort of get into what's going on right now in the world of title designs, especially actually how things have changed with streaming and how important certain broadcast stuff has become in terms of title design as well. So really great to have a conversation with her about that. Sorry, Kristen is not able to join us again this week. It is Thanksgiving, and hopefully those of you guys who had a great Thanksgiving. But I have a couple announcements. I mentioned before, V-Ray 6 is out for many of our products. Most recently, V-Ray 6 for SketchUp, Revit, and the App SDK is out, but they're available for all kind of products. So if you want to check any of this information out about V-Ray 6, just go to chaos.com and get your product updates there. Another thing I'd like to bring up, and I've brought it up several weeks, but I really would love the opportunity for you guys to try it out and to be part of this, is the Partners in Art program. So if you are sort of an independent filmmaker, or you're doing a passion project of some kind, you want to do a short or something bigger than that or different than that, and you need some help, Partners in Art program is exactly what that is available for. You can go to chaos.com/partnersinart, all one word, partners in art. And you should be able to look up the requirements of what it is, and we'll be able to provide you, possibly, if you're accepted into the program, some help with licenses and even some financial help as well. So, love to be able to do that. I've been sort of helped kick off several Partners in Art projects in the past, and it was really great, and it's a great start to a great relationship with some amazing artists. So remember, again, that is chaos.com/partnersinart. Don't have any events announcements this week. It's a little bit slow this week, but we'll let you know when on the next one if there's anything new coming up. But if you'd like to know more about the podcast, you can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast, or you can go to our website, chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you'd like to watch this video, which I highly recommend you do because it was a lot of fun hanging out with Karin over at THU in the Oasis, it is you'll be able to see it at youtube.com/CG youtube.com/Chaos Group TV. And if you have any comments or ideas of other people you'd like to talk to, or any, feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is labs@chaos.com. But for now, please enjoy episode number 403 with Karin Fong.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passe. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
All right.
We're good.
Look at us.
We're good on the swings at THU. These, Andre was like, swings? Why swings? And I love these swings. I've actually spent about 2 hours just hanging out on the swing talking to people last night.
Oh, wow, yeah. No, my kids and I have been on it, but I haven't, the first day I went to the Oasis with that, and then I haven't really gone back down here, but we'll have to go hang out here in the afternoon.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff I want to unpack. I saw your talk yesterday. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
And I definitely have a passion for title sequences, so it was really cool. Sometimes the title sequences are better than the films. But yeah, I'm very, very excited about talking to you about that. I also am interested in a little bit about your past. I know you were born in California.
Yes, outside of Los Angeles.
Okay.
Southern California native.
So you are Southern California native.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And the other thing that I thought was fascinating is the thing that influenced you into the things you do with Sesame Street.
Sesame Street, yes. One of my great all-time heroes is Joan Gans Cooney, the woman who created Sesame Street.
Yeah.
For many reasons. One, it's just as a reminder that we don't always know what the media will be in our future. So I always think when she was a little girl, she couldn't have said, I want to work in educational television. She sort of helped bring that genre up, and in fact it was, Sesame Street was introduced in the late 60s, was a revolutionary thing. And I always think too, like when I was in school, there weren't apps or there weren't, the media changes and you learn how to adapt new media and give it the missions that you want and give it the qualities that you want. And she did that with educational television, which I found was, now where there's so much edutainment, it almost seems, it's mind-boggling to think that in the late 60s that we didn't have these kind of channels for kids where they're learning using all the craftsmanship that went into, advertising and songwriting and high, production value.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but it's also like Sesame Street had an aesthetic and a way of communicating ideas that was very specific.
Yeah.
And still is.
Totally.
And still built on. And it's, and having seen a bunch of your work and seeing a bunch of the work at IF, when you said Sesame Street, it's like, oh, it totally makes sense.
Yeah. Sesame Street, one of the reasons it influenced me even as a child is that its qualities of mixed media. Right. Like the creators brought in, they noticed that children were paying a lot of attention to the television commercials at the time.
Right.
And were immediately, memorizing the jingles of songs. And they're like, well, what if we wrote ad jingles for the letters of the alphabet or for numbers?
Right.
And they brought in, of course, Jim Henson, who at the time was doing, his puppets a lot of times for advertisements. Right. And some of the best people in, cell animation. And so, they had right away with these short, ad-like segments, a whole bunch of media, which I felt I picked up right away even as a kid. I mean, and I think those of us who grew up with Sesame Street can still remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The certain jingles that would, advertise different letters and numbers. Right.
But there was also they, would have information on the screen that would be relevant and timed to that. So there was certain 1, 2, 3, 4 that were coming up, right? And you remember those visuals, and it must have been some, obviously seeing what you guys are doing. Were you giving information on the screen that's even at the title sequence, at a certain time, and sort of exploring that? So that must have been some influence as well, right?
Yeah. Then one can't ever underestimate the power of music and sound design,
yes.
Right? And then when something really works, that the visual is totally, in sync with that. And that just makes it, nth degree more powerful.
Sure.
Right. And so, the songwriting and the music and the design of that on Sesame Street, super powerful. That so completely, influenced how to time visuals out. Because the one without the others is not as powerful at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And plus just the sheer, it had the letter M as a, as a puppet or a S as a snake and just really fun ways of, working with type and working, with numbers and typography in a way and just going through different mediums. Later on in later episodes, those William Wegman dogs with forms, they just, nothing seemed to be off limits. And I think that's, whether it was analog and now, or more technologically sophisticated things, I think, it was all mashed up into one soup.
Yeah. And I think it's great when there's certain, even important songwriters who embrace Sesame Street. Like Feist did a whole song
Yeah.
of like 1, 2, 3, 4, like literally counting penguins on the door or whatever it was.
Yeah.
It was so great. So I was like, oh, it's such a good thing. But I do want to know, so how did you go from Sesame Street to saying that's what I want to do, and how did that become part of your studies, or did you just fall into it later in your life?
Well, in a weird way, I always knew I wanted to be a graphic designer. I just didn't know what it was called when I was little. So I was always making books and comic strips and little magazines I would sell to my family and friends, and cards. At one point, I thought I wanted to be a greeting card artist. I would spend hours in the Hallmark store. You know, I love puns, which is a terrible thing.
No, that's wonderful.
Both visual and verbal ones. And so like this idea of like, having setting up some sort of joke and then revealing this always a reveal is sort of interesting to me. And I thought maybe so this marriage of word and image was always interesting. I always thought I'd maybe go into children's books, which, there's still time for that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would be making little Super 8 films, as I was a teenager. I remember I did one in lieu of a paper in school. My mom's a 3rd grade teacher. I'd make little films for her.
Right.
And I ended up, studying graphic design. I went to Yale, which also has a very good, English. I couldn't really decide between like necessarily writing or verbal things or art. I knew I wanted to go somewhere with an art school. And, luckily graphic design is about that marriage between text and image.
Right.
And so I became an art major and studied that. And I think the thing that might have pushed me even more into this is that I always loved animation.
Right.
But my senior project, which I just showed very, very briefly in my talk, was an animated alphabet book.
Yeah, I remember.
And it was done on Macromedia, or at the time, Macromind Director. And I was just thrilled with it. I think the most thrilling thing probably for me is like the first time I made, a classic, animation test is making a ball bounce.
Yep.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to take this to the lab, get my Super 8 film developed.
Right.
And I could actually edit it. And those of you who are animators know that Macromind, or now it's Macromedia Director, is not really a pro animation
but that's what the tool you had.
That's the tool I had. And at the time when I was in school, in undergrad, everybody thought that we would be reading all our books on CD-ROM. That was the new medium.
The multimedia revolution.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so I did this book. I would, it was very simple in the sense of, if there was the letter F, you would click on a frog, and then a fly would come out, and then you'd click on that and become a film strip, and then fireworks would come up, and you'd back off, and it would be France. So it was this fun sort of like transition thing. I think, honestly, in my heart, I believe in the power of interactivity, but I think it was just really an excuse for me to animate and do these transitions. And then one of my professors at the time, and strangely enough, when I was going to school, it was sort of like in the forefront of doing this. So I remember getting this big, people were lauding my use of technology, which is so funny because I don't really, but like it was this new kind of graphic design. And my teacher, one of my teachers, Michael Rock, said, "Oh, your work is very cinematic." And I was like, what? Because if you've seen this project I did, it is all my own doodles and hand drawings. It has a certain charm, but it's not a very high production value. And he said, no, you think very cinematically. And I thought, what is that? To me, cinematic meant Lawrence of Arabia, like beautiful, vistas and cinematography. And he said, no, there's a way of thinking that you're doing where, it's about the transitions, which is true. Like cinema, unlike theater or some other kinds of art, it's about how you put montage and shots and he's like, the way you go from a cuckoo clock into a circus, that's a very cinematic transition, and you might really enjoy working on film titles, which is totally something I hadn't even thought about. Although
it's very intuitive of them to think about. So this was in the 90s, late 90s?
In the early 90s.
Okay.
I graduated in 1993, and he's like, he said, you might want to go look at our Greenberg Associates after school and see, because your work really speaks to how things flow from one to another. But in between that, I think I also mentioned in my talk, I also interviewed at WGBH Public Television.
Yes.
And went to work for Chris Pullman, who was the vice president of design there, and he had a little unit that did animation for this show called Where in the World is Carmen Santiago?
Yep.
It's a PBS show. There's many versions of it. It was based on the Broderbund game, but
Right.
but there's the PBS version I did had little animated interstitials where the characters would go and these villains would go and steal world monuments, and then
Right.
the kids would, the premise of the show is like you have to find the villain and answer geography questions.
Right.
So I did animated sequence, and well, the funny thing was is that of all the programs that they used to do animation, they used Macromine Director. Right. This was like kind of low budget. It's PBS, but
Right.
very, great on ideas, and it was fun. And so I went to join the team, a small animation team there, and got completely hooked,
Right.
on working on, I said before I might have wanted to go into books or publishing, but
Right.
now I was completely hooked on film and video.
Right.
And so after that, I did look up Kyle Cooper at our Greenberg Associates.
Right.
And ended up getting a job with him and going to Los Angeles
Okay.
to start my career on motion graphics, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So,
Long answer of how I got into this.
well, that's Cal Cooper is obviously well known and for all of the amazing things. And I remember the first time where I sort of started to notice the importance of how title sequences could do, and it was things like Panic Room, and Stranger Than Fiction, and things that started to see the power of words into the images that were there, and it was really kind of striking to me. And I started to really think about the importance of how that works and how it can how those title sequences can be much more than just the title of the movie that's in there. Well, although that's fine too, but there's more to it you can do. What were some of the things that sort of inspired you when you saw some of those title sequences? Like, what was the title sequences that were like, oh, that's the kind of stuff I want to do?
Well, it's funny. I hadn't thought of doing title sequences as a career, because who does when they're in school? So I guess now that you can. But in school, actually, I worked with Hugo Perez, one of my classmates, who was a filmmaker. And funnily enough, he wanted me to do a title sequence for his student soap opera, or when he's like, I've got this idea, and it's like Goldfinger, and I hadn't really seen it. He's like, go look at it, and I was like, ooh, I'll see that the woman in gold paint, and and the idea of actually projecting titles on a body.
Yeah.
So I remember we kind of snuck into the art, one of the classrooms, which is those old Gothic buildings that had it's pitch black in there, and we brought a slide projector, and he took off his shirt, and I was projecting titles and videoing, and that was really one of my first sequences as a student.
That's
just
amazing.
Playing with that and riffing off Goldfinger per Hugo's suggestion. So I owe him that for the first experience of doing that.
Yeah.
But I do remember Boink, he's like, go look at the opening, and of course the Bond titles, legendary.
Right. Yeah,
and then
legendary.
you get hooked, and you're like, what's the Bond? Then you look at all the Bond titles.
Well, well, they did this, and then
Yeah. And it's kind of funny, when I, this date me, but like when I was going to school, like now they're all on the internet, but like before, there's like you had to rent the movie or like get access to it, and somehow, just for many of these classic motion pieces. And so there was something kind of special too about that, seeing it in that film context, like discovering these pieces. But Art Greenberg was super influential for me. I joined up, and just a little history about Imaginary Forces, which is the company I'm at right now, and I have been for 25 years.
Yeah.
It's been a little bit.
Yeah.
They were legendary for creating some of the titles you might know from the 70s and 80s, Alien, or Superman, with the slit scanner, those big titles.
That was Imaginary Forces?
That was RGA. That was the company that became Imaginary Forces.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so for a long time.
So there's Richard Greenberg, big influence, which is funny because my colleague Michelle Doherty had done, the titles for Stranger Things and looked a lot at Richard's work from the 70s and 80s, that kind of typography, the kind of optical. When I first started, we were still doing optical printing, like doing on an Oxbury and burning in titles that way, and it just turned as in the first few years of working towards more of a digital production.
Right.
But yeah, so Richard Greenberg and his brother Bob Greenberg of R. Greenberg Associates did a lot of those classic, title sequences, Dead Zone, and those kind of really beautiful, actually, optical sequences. And so there was a history of the company doing that. And then, of course, we also did, graphics for Chips Ahoy commercials and all kinds of things, and film logos and, so joining up there, we had the whole. We had a sort of like a canon of work by the company, and plus what we knew from, of course, looking at Saul Bass and looking at the Bond titles, and seeing. And it was an interesting time, like starting your career in the early '90s of really some experimental things in music video were going on. Yep. Our music video as a medium really was all over, ubiquitous, and what we all looked at. Right. So combined with all that, there was, a lot of ideas floating around. So we were probably in this little niche. And then, like I mentioned, so I worked at the R. Greenberg branch in LA. It was called RGA LA. Okay. And as we were becoming Imaginary Forces, because I don't know if you know, Bob Greenberg then took RGA to where it is now, which is a huge, internet technology company, agency basically. Right. But we were always in love with still doing film projects and entertainment, and so while he went more in that sort of internet agency business, we retained as Imaginary Forces more of our objective being in film and television and commercial production and some of those things. So Kyle Cooper, who I credit incredibly for being an incredible mentor, in 1995 did Seven, which we really helped launch our company. Yeah. It's a beautiful piece. It's a perfect example of something that fits so well to musically, every frame is so well considered, and fits the horrific movie quite, perfectly. Yeah. So it was this perfect storm where people sat up and kind of took notice again of like what the title sequence could do. Right. And it really helped us really launch into being independent Imaginary Forces. Yeah,
I can imagine that someplace like Seven specifically. I mean, you really have to think about the partnership between the director, because I don't think Kyle Cooper is an amazing person, but I don't think he would have been as successful if it wasn't for Fincher thinking about that as well and working along with him to do that. So there's this partnership between filmmakers, and you sort of mentioned that in your talk as well, of how you communicate with filmmakers and to create the vision they're trying to do. And sometimes they have a vision in their mind and how that story needs to be told. So what are some of the things that when you're thinking about these title sequences, how do you communicate with filmmakers of what you're trying to communicate in that title sequence? Yeah, like I said, and then you're right. I think that was a perfect marriage between David Fincher and Kyle Cooper, in that there was these beautiful notebooks, but then Kyle took it to that nth level. It really, he was, and it's funny. So many people think it's digitally done, but it was still practically done and shot and everything as an example. And working, I think that's one of the best things about my job, is working directly with a director or showrunner or visionary or creator of a show or of a film, and really trying to distill what that tone is or what that emotional feeling is for that sequence you're doing. And it becomes, I kind of joked, it becomes sort of a bit of a therapy session between, because then it really makes, it's such a contained exercise, right? Right. It's a little different than the music that goes maybe over the whole film, or the costumes that go over the whole film, but you're now looking at this section that maybe, 2.5 minutes max, even that, and trying to think of how you want it to feel. And I think, the best collaboration is really that back and forth, and a lot of dialogue of what it needs to be, and what influences and
we want the audience to feel, and pulling, and so much of it too is knowing what not to put in, like like any good creative decision, it's also knowing where to pull back. And I think there's a temptation with title sequence sometimes to be like, it needs to be this and this and this and this and this.
Right.
Like it has to encompass everything about the show.
Right.
And it's too short to do that.
Yeah.
And it won't be powerful. The more you try to like put in everything, the more mushy it gets, right?
Right.
And so it's like really about talking about like, no, really the important thing is this, you know. I look at some of the more successful ones, and there's always this, I can tell there's always a temptation, like, should we show the actor? Should we show a scene? No, it's better just to show the hands in the book. It's better just to do it with the typography. It's better just to have a man falling, like, like just pull, think, start, you can start wide, but we need to pull back and really get to, what that impression is, and it can have a lot of meaning in itself, and we can layer things, but it's hard when you're asked to make a sequence that's short that encompasses a whole world, to really be disciplined sometimes and be like, no. And I talked a little bit of Lisey's story, which I had just done last year, and Pablo Larraín was very, brave, I think, or like very focused in the beginning of just saying, no, we aren't going to show that world. We don't need to show my scenes. We don't need to, because there's some beautiful scenes that allude to the world of the imagination.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe, do you want to go into that? No. Like, let's make it about their inner emotional life. Let's make it stark, which is an interesting perspective. And the same, there's one of the lessons I learned, I worked on Boardwalk Empire, and which had the most amazing set in Brooklyn. Like, you couldn't believe this set. It's like you've been on it, and sometimes they're just facades of buildings. Right. But this one, you could go into the taffy shop with a working taffy maker, and you can go into the laundry shop. It was like you could shoot in, you could shoot out, and it was this gorgeous boardwalk. And of course, so my first idea is like we explore the boardwalk from the main character's point of view, and you're seeing all these things, and we'll explore this whole world. Like, they have this gorgeous set. We'll montage these details. There's all this great typography, because it takes place in the 20s and in Prohibition. So there's wonderful just like production design. And then I remember Terry Winters and HBO said like, no, we don't want a montage of everything. We want something that will make people kind of sit up and like take notice and and which is sort of interesting. And at first it was heartbreaking to me. I was like, what? You don't want me to shoot this beautiful, like, why are we not shooting all this? But again, I credit them with just taking a look, and they're like, no, we want to see our main character as the eye of the storm. Right. And it's not about this showing, the set. Gotcha. We need a sort of like an idea where people are like, huh? Like, and so in the end, we shot Steve Buscemi. Right. Which was great. And he's, surrounded by sort of like an ever-changing storm. In fact, you don't see the boardwalk at all. Right. You see him looking out to the horizon of the beach of Atlantic City. Mm-hmm. And it's just a completely 180 from what I wanted before. But then but it's so much more. You're about to go into the show and see these amazing sets. There's no reason for me to
bring it up.
Like to make it like a trailer or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. But you also mentioned like the challenges. So like you said, do you get to see the whole film before and sort of get inspired by the film to do the title sequence, or sometimes you just get a script and you have a few hours to pitch. So how, like, explain that process, like.
Well, most of the time, as you know, a film is wet clay. It's so funny because I've taught before, I've critiqued at art schools, and they might have a project about title design, but it's always sort of misleading because the students are always looking at the finished movie, and the instructor's like, well, now make a title for this movie. So you see everything just set as it is. But when you're working on film, as you all know, work on it, it's all this wet clay. Endings can be ditched to the last minute. Characters can get cut out, you know. Tones can shift, especially in a series, it starts as something and then they shoot and, it might turn into something else, or, it's all, and then you're into that process. Now, usually the title design, a lot of the times it takes place near the end, when the latter half after production, or as production is closing up, and you get a little bit. Luckily, most of the time I do get to see some dailies. I always look at what all the other designers are doing. I always ask for the set designs and the costumes and anything that can tell me about this world visually.
Right.
And it's just like trying to get as much as you can. Sometimes there'll be a very rough cut, or even just an assembly, which to everybody is just scenes cut together. It's extremely long, no final music, but just to get the story. So there's varying degrees of what I get to see, but usually very rarely the finish, something close to finish, because you're working alongside everybody making the show.
Right.
And the advantage of that too is that I like it when filmmakers or showrunners contact me somewhat early, because if there's an opportunity to shoot on their set, or if need be an actor like Steve Buscemi, or or have I shot all these props burning. It was like the last day of their shoot for little fires everywhere. We had a very simple idea of little fires just basically burning many of the crucial objects and props in the show. But that could be arranged for as soon as when they were done with the props on their last day of shooting, but we still had pyrotechnics available to do that.
Right.
So it's nice to be contacted early enough that if we could use the set or something.
Right.
I think I mentioned in Counterpart, we had access to their beautiful set, which can generate a lot of material.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing that's interesting, I was thinking about it during your talk, is that, back in the old days, main titles would always be at the beginning. Now we do a lot of main on ends, right? And so, which is at the end of the film. Which I remember my son was confused because we watched an old movie. It's like, why are they putting the titles at the beginning?
And there's so many too. Sometimes
they used to be at the beginning. Having them at the end was a new phenomenon, and now that's like all we do.
Of main on end. Yeah.
Main on end. So, but the main on end idea is like, it's great because the main title, you can be much more freeing to do what you want without any spoilers.
Yes, exactly.
so what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, it's a different challenge. It's wonderful to have that freedom. You can like revisit moments in the story. It's a different feeling. Like a main title, its function is to kind of draw people in a certain way. Like I explained that. So much of title design is creating this magic portal, right? Like, okay, leave your real life behind. You just had to deal with that terrible parking lot, and you're settled in your seat. Your popcorn's fine now. You can enter the movie now, or you can even just be if you're on your couch, you can leave real life behind. And so that's that portal. The main title bridges that world and lets you yourself in. And then I think for the end titles, it's similar, but now you want to give a feeling for people to, quote, leave the theater, even if it's somebody watching at home, but like you're giving a parting emotion, which is different. I think it's always kind of thrilling when there's a main title in the beginning of a film that's integrated really interestingly to get you into the film. But the end titles, like you say, we had just most recently worked on the Spider-Man No Way Home ones, and it is cool because you don't have to worry. There are things that you can reference back and wink about from the film. Like there were it was based on a sketchbook, and so there were even like things that we did that are very faintly printed, almost like on the back of a sketchbook page, that are kind of Easter eggs if you wanted to stop and once it's on media, that you could stop and you could look at it and be like, oh, that's the letter that Peter sent, or that's the and so it's really fun incorporating some of those things. You can go, you don't have to worry, and there's always a concern in the beginning of a film too, of like, you want it to feel, you never want your titles to take too long or to actually feel long, obviously, and there's always a concern in the beginning of a film, like, okay, we're taking too long to get into the story. So you're always very conscious of that instead of designing. And the funny thing is, like, sometimes the absolute time doesn't matter. It's just how a scene feels, right? It's the same for titles. But at the end, you have a little more luxury of that. You don't have to worry about, we got to get into it. It feels long here. It's a good. We really enjoyed the Spider-Man one, just for all those, all those layers we could put in.
And there's things you could put in that you could not put in if you had it at the beginning.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. So the Spider-Man ones, I did mention that, you always have to keep your projects under wraps anyway.
Right.
But this one was like top secret, crazy
Sure.
lockdown security because nobody was supposed to know. It kind of leaked on the internet, early, but that there were 3 Spider-Mans that the original, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield would be in the film at all.
Right.
It was a closely guarded secret. Of course, look at the title sequences, you know that right away.
Right, exactly.
Or we had a lot of images with 3 Spider-Men, cavorting around.
Plus, you'd have to have their names.
Yeah, exactly. That was like the super under wraps, and also their images because the sketchbooks have their faces, and so even as we were having artists work on it, it's like so there was that too, and of course you couldn't put that at the front, but we had all these jokes with the 3 of them at the end, so that was super fun.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to ask you about, because my wife has done some title stuff as well and graphic things, much more simple things, but she did also a lot of end crawls back in the day when she was like, that was the tiring thing that I did. End crawls are tough.
Yeah, they're tough.
They're tough and they're very technical.
Yeah,
but
I usually try to get out of them.
Yeah, but there's how, the size of the letters has to be specific, and how big someone's name is, and how long it's on screen, and all of those types of things.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that challenge, those constraints. How do you work within those constraints to make sure, I can read that person's name?
Yeah.
That the title of the movie is bigger than this. There's a bunch of rules out there that you have to work in, right?
Yeah, for main titles. Yeah. I'm less. I usually set a style sheet for a crawl.
Sure.
Make sure it doesn't strobe and have somebody who specializes in that.
Yep.
But yeah, you bring up a really awesomely geeky question.
Yeah.
But I get that. And somebody was at the THU conference was asking me what are some of the biggest limitations you have as a title designer, which was an excellent question. One is time, but the other is this sort of phenomena that was probably invisible to most people of what is legal requirements.
Right.
Because after all, all said is done. There, you can do a beautiful sequence and it can be part of the story, but it has a legal function.
And the unions are involved in making sure that person's name is this size.
Yeah. So there's a legal. Much like a book's, copyright page or something, it's a legal thing that is required to show who worked in the film, and there are size requirements, mostly dictated by, So just a little bit of history here. The idea of credits and billing is taken from the theater world.
Okay.
So in a theater sign, in Broadway or other productions at the time, you would know who has the top billing, who is the biggest actor, talent in a production they'd get their name on top.
Right.
So movies have followed that convention in that the first ranked actor is the top, or the actors above title that come up before the title comes on, Tom Cruise, Top Gun,
right.
That's that's a negotiated position before. So the order of the titles matter very much. It's a pretty prescribed, whether you're above, before title, or after title.
Right.
And then you will, as a title designer, usually get a sheet of what the size requirements of the crew and the cast are. And what it's pegged to is the actual size of the title, which is measured by the height of the letters.
Height of the letters.
Yeah. So it's not font size.
Okay.
It's like, and as long as you can, do these calculations and make them justifiably so, it's fine. So for instance, I'm in the DGA, the Directors Guild, and I'm having worked on all these projections. I know the DGA requirement is that I'm going to get that wrong, but the director's name has to be at least 40% of the title. And this is to protect.
At least 40%.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you, or you have to get a waiver from them. And this is basically to protect, let's say the studio's mad at a director. They can't put the name super tiny and legible, and cheat the director out of the credit, right?
Right.
The WGA has similar. Writers Guild of America has similar. A lot of the times there's a ripple effect. So a lot of times maybe the writer's credit is also compared, it can't be less than the director's credit. So there's this starts to be this whole thing where, this person can't be less than these people. And so what I usually do is make everybody the same size.
Right.
Find the requirement and make everybody so there's no, because usually don't want type, there's some instances where I've had to use different sizes and different names, but usually I don't want to like make this obvious and have people bounce around, because people won't argue if their size, it's a minimum requirement. So so you can always make people bigger. You can always make somebody more than their 40% or 100% of everything. So you start to play with these credit sizes. But somebody asked me once in a talk, like, why isn't there more experimentation with the typography? And some of it is because you have these legal requirements. That's why I love so much there. And then you can do it, except that like I remember for 7, I believe Kyle got a waiver, or got asked the production, and Fincher got waivers from the actors. You can always go to the actors' agents or the different and try to tell them, like, look here, it's a little unconventional, and see if they can sign off. And luckily they did on something like that, and you can see they're still evenly treated. Yep. But but that's why when you see credits that there isn't a lot of like variation. But I love the ones that do. Like, I think Thank You for Not Smoke, or Thank You for Smoking, had this wonderful thing where they found all the titles on different cigarette packages. That comes to mind. I mentioned one of my Delicatessen is one of my all-time favorites. I think being French, I think that film maybe didn't have the American Union. When I do an indie film, I sometimes try to do. I did an indie film where you found different things like on dynamo tape, and then are stenciled on something, because you're not controlled by those union requirements. Sure. And we're just working on one that I'm hoping right now, we're just finishing right now, where it's very much influenced by punk graphics. And so I was like, dang, but if we're going to be, influenced by the Lower East Side and punk flyers and, and music, like, can we not have the credits be different, hand-done examples? And I think right now it's going through approval, so fingers crossed that we can. It just takes a little bit more legwork, and when it's crunch time, it's hard to do. Right. And you need a good reason to do it, obviously. Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you can't just. It has to fit the idea. Yep. Yeah.
I do remember, like, when the first time I sort of became aware of this size thing was we were watching Signs, and Signs is like this. The huge title says Signs, and then M. Night Shyamalan was like just like a block of white, like, because it's like it's like that's M. Night Shyamalan's a lot of letters compared to Signs. I remember. Do you remember that title?
Yes. And one of my earliest was working on the title of Richie Rich, and Macaulay Culkin.
That's a lot of letters.
And so you can't help it, like when somebody's name is like Macaulay Culkin, but and poor Richie Rich's name is like this big, and it's like you're like, how can we make this look like the title and still meet our size requirements? Right. And you could do tricky things, like you could have a zoom, and then you say, oh, the average of the zoom is so there's all these little shenanigans we do. That the main thing, and I agree, is like you want to give the respect to the crew and the act and the talent. It is a title sequence, and not treat them as a thing that's illegible in the interest of trying to make something cool. But so I get the protections, but it is just one more thing you got to do when you're designing these.
It just makes me realize how revolutionary Apocalypse Now was, which had no titles in the entire film.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So there's no titles at all, and the only way that they were able to call it Apocalypse Now is because at one point in the film, there was graffiti on a wall that said Apocalypse Now. And that was the title of the film.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's in the middle of the film, too. So that's how they did it. It's like, oh, wow. It's like, how did they get away with that? It's like, well, they didn't have those rules back then. But yeah. Okay, I do want to talk about music. And you mentioned the importance of music.
Oh, absolutely.
And how, obviously you use timing, et cetera. And you mentioned, obviously, music videos had some influence back in the 90s and things of that nature. But when you're doing the title sequence, do you come up with the music that you think would work, or are you given a piece of music to start your influence? Like, how does that, or is it either or?
Oh gosh, it's a grab bag of things. Like sometimes a showrunner or a director comes with something, you know, or more often than not, you're starting off finding music or musicians themselves or whatever, and we'll put what we call a click track on.
Right.
And something we think that has a feeling, or we'll ask, the best ways to start actually is to ask the composer of the film or the show, are there any, you know, and usually they'll be like, oh no, gosh, I haven't composed that yet.
Right.
But they'll have click tracks or they'll have mood music from other things and say like, I'm thinking of, this is the mood of the film, or
Right.
you'll hear little snippets of tests for the film, and you can use that. Sometimes we'll then go even further and go into their sites and try to find something they've composed before that we think might work better. We're always struggling, and one of the things that really to us makes the title work often is you know, dynamic changes, you know, or a build, or you know, something that propels you through the sequence.
Right.
And sometimes you get that in these samples, and sometimes you just don't because they're just flavor, you know, samples. But we'll try to find something that works that we can cut our images to, listen to while we're. And then sometimes, you know, it will. If it's there's some instances where we find a click track and we all fall in love with it.
Yep.
So much that even when we try something else, it doesn't work, and if we can license it, then great. I remember I worked with Harold Ramis on this comedy Bedazzled, like back in the day. And you know, we had, and you know, some of the fun is trying unconventional music. It was kind of like this kind of country, or this country song, "You're the One I've Been Looking For,"
right.
And it just worked perfectly with the sequence. And even heightened the comedy. Even afterwards, the music supervisor was like, okay, let's try some other things.
Right.
And tried some more techno stuff. It was a sequence where Brendan Fraser's just going around the city, and you know, there's some time lapse and things. And you know, it just didn't I think
work.
we'd all gotten used to this kind of fun, you know, rhythm of it. And you know, Matthew Weiner suggested the RJD2 song for Mad Men right off, like that was, which was a brilliant sort of thing. That I love it sometimes when there's this tension between what the visuals are doing and the music, because like he could have picked you know, something that's period from that time.
Sure.
Right? Makes total sense. He uses all that wonderful music in Mad Men of the time, right?
Right.
But the fact that he had something, you know, contemporary just gives it so much more of that edge. I felt with Boardwalk Empire the same thing. We were cycling through all kinds of music, and that's kind of fun. It's really fun to take a sequence, the same exact sequence, and just lay different music. We put Bob Dylan down on that. We put, you know, an old ditty from the 20s from that. That was, you know, we put classical, just to see how it changes.
Right.
And again, it was a contemporary piece in the end that just made it feel, you know, because sometimes when the visuals are period piece and the music is period, it just drives it into this place where you don't feel it's, you know, like when you're in the drama, it's current to you, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a historical piece.
Right.
So the music can help a lot with that.
Yeah. I do. What was there was a trailer to Marie Antoinette that was done with 80s music.
Yeah.
It totally changed the mood of the film.
Totally.
And it's such a great idea, but to do that. But like for example, like Stranger Things, it's such an iconic image and sound that went together. So I almost want to say, what came first? Did they come to, like, did the sound come first? Was there a soundtrack that happened and then you guys inspired to it?
It's kind of a melding of, and that's when it's the best. It's when you can work, you know, the best is when we can, even in storyboard form, show the, you know, composer what we're thinking of, and the composer sends us something, and we're like, that's great, but could, you know, we're going to hit it, you know, here, there's something, can we time it? And, you know, so that dialogue, and of course the Duffers were that, you know, very specific of what they wanted.
Right.
The attention to the detail of that kind of period, of those Richard Greenberg 70s, 80s, is very, very, very specific. And, you know, that can't be discounted too, of like the vision of the showrunners and and the director of like, okay, you know, I know I really want it to be this slice of life, or this bit of this feeling is so specific.
Right.
I'm going to tell, you know, my composer and my designers, this is what we're working towards, and that helps too. You know, you know, that works, but then there's also the open book, you know, like, okay, like I mentioned John Watts in the beginning, the Spider-Man No Way Home ends on a bittersweet note. And in the beginning we thought, well, maybe it's not as,
not as
toe tapping.
Yeah, toe tapping.
And we tried some other things, and then he quickly realized, I think, that he's like, no, we need that energy. We need the Steve Ditko bright graphics. We need the maximalism. We need that energy because we've ended on this note.
Right, to help us get out of it.
Yeah, and then so the music, then that totally changes the music, direction.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing I think that's really cool about what you guys are doing and the influences that you've had is that your titles are timeless, and titles are sometimes very dated.
Well, it's kind of you to say they're timeless.
Yeah, they are, and it's very interesting because I think you guys borrow from so many different things. You're not necessarily trying to be in the moment. You are looking at different things out there. So I think I was trying to allude to this question. I'm going to get a little deeper into it, yesterday. But there is a lot of stuff that technology is allowing us to look at as exploring as different interesting ideas, especially things like Houdini has all these procedural things that you can do that are so cool and interesting, right? Yeah. But you don't want to be like, oh, that's that plugin from After Effects or whatever. That's like, oh, that was popular back in the 90s. You know what I mean? Like there's that one plugin.
Blue wash that we all use.
Yeah, exactly. So how does technology help create these cool ideas, but also how do you suppose, like, I don't want to do this thing where it just looks like something that came out in 1995?
Right. It's a tough one because, of course, when you're in the moment, you don't know what that look for. I think the number one thing is, like, being true to the world of the story. Yeah. Wherever that is, if it's the 80s, straight, or is it the 60s? Is it now? But it's a very specific subculture, and really diving deep into the material is helpful, because the most important thing is that the titles match, that they are proper, encapsulation of the world of the film or the show. Sure. And so really digging deep there and not being distracted by the outside of like, oh, there's this cool thing I want to try here. Of course we look at all the wonderful things being made with the technology, but I think for me, and always, even just as a graphic designer, even if I was working on a poster or whatever, the idea always comes first. Right. I jokingly showed a pencil as the first piece of technology we use, of just, let's figure out what we want as an idea first. Let's just not worry about, and this has gotten me into trouble before too, when it comes to production, but I can't help it. It's the way I think. Sure. Let's think about what that idea is at the very beginning. And maybe it is like too big at first, but we can find ways to keep the essence of that idea, as we go into production, I think it's sketching out those ideas, looking at what we really want to do. For instance, for one of our titles, we thought, I was working with Alan Williams, one of my collaborators, and he's like, wouldn't it be great to build a big cathedral that floods with water? Right. We can't do that, right? But we can build the little creche, the statues and have a water level. We can, now when we go into production, we can revisit that idea and figure out how to do it. But in the initial phases, we're really trying to drill down into an idea. And of course, part of design is looking at what you have and what you can do, what you can afford, but we like that free vision at first, and then being able to be like, okay, we will be able to do this. We do have time to do this in Houdini. We don't have time to do a full 3D piece or budget, but we do have this one thing that'd be awesome to photograph, or, Right. And so I think keeping true to the story is one thing. I think too, like, keeping, always taking a step back and seeing, what that editorial style might accomplish. I mentioned this punk thing we're doing, or this music-driven thing. Sure. What are we, are we picking an editorial style that furthers the emotional mood or agenda of the story, or is it, are we doing this to to hide something we don't have, or to, and I think one of the things too that hopefully keeps things kind of classic is, attention to actual typography itself too, because, you fling off some font on the moment, or something, or don't pay attention to that. And then that's what I think sometimes you're like, ooh, that wasn't set so nice. And
Don't just put Trajan out there.
Yeah, exactly. What are the Google Trajan alternatives? Exactly.
Yep.
And then Kyle always would tell me, oh, you see, make sure that attention to those details are heated, because you project it on a big screen, you will see it. I always tell students, like, don't forget the kern, don't forget these little things, because those details, you don't think you see it when you're working small, but remember, your work's going to be projected.
Really big, yeah. And then that end looks a little...
Yeah, exactly. You wish you'd fixed that.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting. What do you think are some of the trends you're seeing, like, coming up in the future? Like, what are some of the things happening in title sequences that I think would be something to look like? I think this is where they're going to go.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting right now with premium and streaming television. That's really revolutionized. I touched on that yesterday, in that because there aren't time constraints everybody wants to get to the show, of course,
right.
but there aren't time constraints on titles. You can have them evolve, and you can have them evolve to the point where different episodes have different sequences, or we're starting to see different seasons, slight changes between updates on title sequences, so it becomes part of the storytellings and experiences. Easter eggs being, reasons. We all want to give people reasons not to skip the titles, and and the showrunners and the people.
But that's the thing. They have the power to skip the title. How do you feel about that?
Well, as I said in my talk, it's like, of course I want people to rage watch the titles. It's like, yes, and I make my family watch the titles.
Right.
We're watching shows even as we're going on, doing a little binge, just out of solidarity to my designers, and also I enjoy them. But honestly, so of course I want people to watch them, and I feel like the onus is on us as designers and people making the content to make them interesting enough.
Right.
And that's why I always push it on to musicians too. I'm like, it's your theme. If they love your theme, they're not gonna skip it.
Yeah, it's true.
But I think people are getting into it, and we're realizing there's opportunity there. In terms of skipping the titles, though, the reality is that they've become, because of the way our media has evolved.
Right.
Happily, they have a life almost outside the show as much as they do as in front of the show.
Yeah. Yeah, as in Game of Thrones, it's like you watch the titles because you want to know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because every show has its own title and shows where we're going to go today.
Totally. I love that. That's a super opportunity, a smart way of using. This is, like I said, this is a legal requirement. You got to show the actors' names. Why not make it like an opportunity where you can show these sort of things? And also, how many times have you seen a title outside the show?
Right.
Like where somebody forwarded, hey, look at this cool title, or, you've watched it on the internet, and it functions as a short film or this trailer, and which is a huge opportunity, I think, for platforms that, like, why do a title? Because you can use that, for people almost to carry a piece of the show with them while they're not, and connecting to it while they're not watching your show, right? Because, you're usually not in that world, but my goodness, when people are immediately transported to that show when they see, the iconic logo or hear that music. You can be anywhere and hear it's Pavlovian almost.
Yeah. Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
You immediately say that. You
right?
can hear it,
Years later, right? Shows I watch. Right? Like, it's like, what? You know?
And you can just see the titles in front of your face. Yeah.
Exactly. It brings you right there. So the power of titles are actually even more so because of our short format video environments that we're now moving through. So does it matter if you skip it? I'd rather you didn't, but it doesn't really matter. It almost has more, these little haikus of the show have more, potency, as their own standalones in some ways. And I showed Cowboy Bebop last night.
That's so cool.
It's fun. I mean, I had great source material, right? Yeah. And but the idea that talk about a soundtrack that really, oh my goodness. But it was super cool. Netflix dropped it before the show, and it became this thing where people suddenly eyes were on Cowboy Bebop and gearing up for that launch. And I know other platforms have done that too, where they use that as a tool almost, to build anticipation, which is exactly what titles are doing, but in a way, the traditional way is obviously just to see it right before the show, but now it's almost like giving it even more lead time and more, more of that portal from the real world.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. We don't have much time. We'll go a little over if that's okay.
Yeah, it's
but I
okay.
do want to know, because you guys also have done this, IDs, like the Netflix N. Like, that's so big and so important, yet
We just
it's
did
like
an update too, yeah.
it's like a few seconds.
Yeah.
Like, how is, like, tell us about that. Like, doing something like that is a big deal, right?
Yeah, no. And I should stress, and I kind of open with this in my talk, is that, you know, most of the work we do is not in title sequences.
Right.
It's probably our most visible work, our
Right.
most internationally known work, and
Right.
it connects us to so many people.
Right. And it gets you more work.
It gets us more work, and they're just fun to do, frankly.
Yeah.
But you know, we have a full, you know, creative company that is creating things from brand films to, you know, to commercial production to films for architectural installations. I've even worked on one for an opera, you know, things that, you know, so everything as small as things on your phone to like big, you know, big spaces.
Right.
And that, like you mentioned, includes branding and logos for studios,
Sure.
teasers and trailers. So in terms of, I think, you know, it's like sort of like I give a talk at something like THU, and I know most people aren't title designers.
Right.
It's a niche thing.
Yeah.
But the things you learn from it are like, okay, how do you make something resonate in somebody's memory? You know, how do you, what makes something iconic? Right? Like, what makes it so it's something ownable? Like, I kind of joke about that Pavlovian response, but, you know, what are those ingredients, and doing that in a short amount of time? And I think the logos that you mentioned are the ultimate in doing this in the short, you know, you get a brief, and some there are different durations usually you have to do, maybe one that's like 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 12 seconds, this depending on, you know, the use, whether it's in front of their theatrical films, or, you know, or whether it's just the blip on a trailer.
Right.
Or
just opening the app.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all, you know, they have to translate, but have to be quick, and like how can you make that impression?
Right.
Is the design challenge, which is cool. We just did an update actually to the Netflix. We did the original their N and their Spectrum.
Yeah.
And we just did an update, which was great. But, you know, there's a certain like just kind of burst of beauty that you want to present.
Right.
You know, and these things have to be, you know, I always judge the success of a project in that it's successful if it can't necessarily be for any other story or brand. You know, you want it to be bespoke. You don't want it to be so generic that, you know, you could easily put it in front of this brand, or in front of this story, or, you know, even if the themes are similar, right? Like, I wouldn't want our Spider-Man to be okay for another Spider. It should be for that specific one. Or if you're doing a mob movie, you know, or a cop show, like, it shouldn't be like, oh, well, that could go, you know, equally on, you know, it should have something about it that is ownable, basically.
Right.
And I think these, like you mentioned, these logos are probably the ultimate in like trying to make something ownable in the shortest amount of time, really.
I never thought about the design challenge. Like, this has to feel good in front of any show. Like, whether it's a comedy or a horror or anything, it's like, oh, right.
Yeah.
And just thinking about, like, this could be in front of anything, you know?
Yeah. Which is so different than the titles, too, like, where it should only be in front of this comedy, or it should feel like a thriller.
Right.
When you're doing these logos, it's got to feel like there's a breath. Like, it has to feel okay in front of, like, the most serious film, and, you know, in front of a loony animation, you know, so.
Yeah, interesting. It's really fascinating. Well, this has been an amazing talk. You've been an amazing person to hang out with over at THU, and it's you know, I'd love to continue talking to you about this stuff, because I've got lots of questions. but yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, and thank you for your interest in what I do. It's been a pleasure, and I'm enjoying my time here at THU.
Awesome. All right, thanks.